"You're the only one who came back," she cried, and as the veteran's single dad stood frozen, her tears weren't for joy, but for the truth he'd been hiding. A truth that could shatter both their hearts forever. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn chill wrapped around the small gathering like a somber blanket. Jack Mercer stood rigid beside the Veterans Memorial, his daughter Ella's warm hand tucked into his. The morning sun cast long shadows across the granite monument, where fresh flowers dotted the base like splashes of watercolor against stone. Jack's military posture hadn't softened in the years since his return. He wore his civilian clothes, a dark blue jacket and pressed khakis, with the same precision as his old uniform. But Ella noticed how his fingers twitched against hers when the bugle's first clear notes pierced the morning quiet. "You okay, Dad?" she whispered, squeezing his hand. He managed a small nod, his jaw clenched tight. Around them, townspeople held framed photographs of sons, daughters, spouses, faces frozen in time, forever young in their dress uniforms. The weight of their absence pressed down on the crowd like the heavy autumn sky above. Reverend Cole stepped up to the simple podium, his white hair catching the early light. His familiar voice carried across the gathering with gentle authority. "We come together today not just to remember, but to honor. To honor not only those who gave their lives, but those who carry their memory." Jack's eyes drifted to the wall of names, each letter etched deep into the dark stone. His gaze found the one he both sought and dreaded. Daniel Ellison. The name seemed to pulse against the granite, each letter a hammer strike against his conscience. A young widow in a black dress approached the wall, carrying a bouquet of white roses. As she laid them down, Jack's hands began to shake. Ella felt the tremor and pressed closer to his side, though she couldn't fully understand the demons that haunted her father. She only knew that on days like this, he seemed to retreat into a place she couldn't follow. "The burden of memory is heavy," Reverend Cole continued, his words floating over the hushed crowd. "But so too is the grace of forgiveness. It is in forgiving others and ourselves that we truly honor those who have gone before us." Jack swallowed hard. Ella watched a muscle work in his jaw, the way it did when he was fighting to maintain control. She'd seen that look too many times over the years, usually late at night when he thought she was asleep and his nightmares drove him to pace the hallway. The crowd shifted as people moved forward to place their own tributes. Flowers, photos, small flags that fluttered in the cool breeze. Jack remained rooted in place, his boots planted as if he were still standing at attention. Ella noticed how other veterans in the crowd would glance his way, their eyes full of something like recognition mixed with concern. "Let us remember," Reverend Cole's voice softened, "that while some gave all gave some. And those who returned carry burdens we cannot see but must help them bear." The bugle called out again, playing taps. The notes hung in the air like crystal, each one perfect and piercing. Jack's grip on Ella's hand tightened until it almost hurt, but she didn't pull away. She'd learned long ago that sometimes her father needed an anchor to keep him from drifting too far into his memories. As the final note faded into silence, people began to disperse slowly, moving away in small groups, their voices hushed in respect. Jack remained still, his eyes fixed on Daniel's name. Ella watched as an older couple walked past, the woman dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while her husband supported her elbow. "Dad?" Ella tugged gently at his hand. "Maybe we should—" But her words cut off as she noticed a woman approaching them. She moved with purpose through the thinning crowd, her steps faltering slightly as she drew closer. She wore a simple navy dress, her dark hair touched with gray at the temples, and her eyes were fixed on Jack with an intensity that made Ella want to step between them. The woman stopped a few feet away, her hand rising to her throat as if to catch her breath. Jack turned slowly, and Ella felt him go completely still beside her. The woman's face had drained of color, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You're the only one who came back," she gasped, her voice breaking on the words like thin ice. Ella felt her father's hand slip from hers. She watched as he took a single step forward, reaching out to take the woman's trembling hand in his own. His silence spoke volumes, filled with years of unspoken grief and guilt. Behind them, the memorial bells began to toll, their deep resonance rolling across the morning like waves of sound. The woman, who Ella would soon learn was Grace Ellison, stood there with her hand in Jack's, tears streaming down her face. Jack remained frozen, his shoulders rigid with tension, unable to find words for this moment he'd both dreaded and longed for. The bells continued their solemn count, marking time as these two people, bound by loss and memory, stood connected by their shared pain in the shadow of the memorial wall. The late afternoon sun glinted off the chrome trim of Grace's weathered sedan as she sat parked outside Miller's Diner, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Through the large front window, she could see Jack Mercer and his daughter seated in a worn red booth, sharing what looked like the diner's famous hamburgers. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The shock of seeing him at the memorial ceremony still hadn't worn off. For years, she'd imagined him dead alongside Daniel, their bodies forever lost in that foreign land. But here he was, alive and breathing, sitting less than 50 feet away. Grace watched as Ella laughed at something her father said, her ponytail bouncing with the movement. The girl's joy was pure and unrestrained, so different from Jack's careful, measured responses. Even from here, Grace could see how his shoulders remained tense, like he was perpetually bracing for impact. "What am I doing here?" Grace whispered to herself, running trembling fingers through her shoulder-length brown hair. She hadn't planned to follow them, but after the ceremony, her car seemed to have a mind of its own, trailing their pickup truck through the quiet streets of town. Inside the diner, Ella dabbed a French fry in ketchup and looked up at her father. "Dad, why did that lady look at you like she'd seen a ghost this morning?" Jack's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He took a long sip of his coffee before answering. "She's just someone from the old unit, sweetheart. It's been a while since we've seen each other." "But she seemed so surprised," Ella persisted, her bright eyes searching her father's face. "War's complicated, Elle. Some memories are better left in the past." Jack's tone was gentle but firm, the same voice he used whenever Ella asked about her mother or his time overseas. Grace watched this exchange through the window, her breath fogging the glass. The autumn air had grown colder, but that wasn't why she shivered. Seeing Jack with his daughter, it brought back memories of Daniel talking about the children they'd planned to have, dreams that died in a foreign desert, buried alongside her husband. Her fingers found the wedding ring she still wore on a chain around her neck. The metal was warm against her skin, a constant reminder of what she'd lost. But now, for the first time in years, she had a chance to understand why. Taking a deep breath, Grace stepped out of her car. The bell above the diner's door chimed as she entered, drawing several curious glances from the regular customers. The smell of coffee and grilled onions filled the air, but her stomach was too knotted to notice. Jack's head snapped up at her entrance, his expression guarded. But before either adult could speak, Ella's face lit up with recognition. "Hey, you're the lady from the ceremony," Ella said, waving her over. "I'm Ella. Did you serve with my dad?" Grace's practiced smile felt brittle on her face. "No, sweetie. I'm Grace. I knew your father from before." "Would you like to join us?" Ella asked, already sliding over to make room. "Dad always gets quiet when people from before are around. Maybe you can tell me some stories?" Jack's coffee cup clinked against its saucer. "Ella, I'm sure Mrs. Ellison has other plans." "Actually," Grace interrupted, surprising herself, "I'd love to join you, if that's okay." She looked directly at Jack, silently challenging him to refuse. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded stiffly, gesturing to the empty space beside his daughter. Grace slid into the booth, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The vinyl seat squeaked beneath her, the sound unnaturally loud in the awkward silence that followed. "Can I get you anything, hon?" The waitress appeared, coffee pot in hand, a welcome interruption. "Just coffee, please. Black." The next 15 minutes stretched like molasses. Ella, bless her heart, tried to keep the conversation going, peppering both adults with questions about their lives. Jack answered in clipped sentences, while Grace managed small talk about the weather and the town's upcoming harvest festival. Neither adult mentioned Daniel. Neither spoke of the ambush that had changed all their lives. Instead, they danced around the elephant in the room, their forced smiles and careful words, a poor mask for the tension crackling between them. Ella, though young, wasn't blind to the strange atmosphere. Her cheerful chatter gradually diminished, replaced by confused glances between her father and their unexpected guest. She pushed her remaining fries around her plate, creating abstract patterns in the ketchup. When Grace finally stood to leave, her coffee was cold and barely touched. "Thank you for letting me join you," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It was lovely to meet you, Ella," the girl beamed, seemingly immune to the heaviness in the air. "You should come over sometime. Dad's teaching me how to fix up old radios in the garage." Jack's face remained carefully neutral, but his knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. Grace managed another smile, this one barely reaching her eyes. "That's very sweet of you to offer, Ella. Maybe sometime." She turned and walked to the door, each step feeling like it took tremendous effort. The bell chimed again as she pushed it open, the cool air rushing in to meet her. At her car, Grace couldn't help but look back through the diner's large window. Jack was still sitting ramrod straight in the booth, his face a mask of controlled emotion. Ella was talking animatedly about something, her hands moving in excited gestures, but her father's eyes were fixed on Grace's retreating form. "Why did you survive when he didn't?" Grace whispered to herself, her words carried away by the autumn wind. She could feel the weight of Jack's gaze even through the glass, but she couldn't bring herself to meet it. Instead, she opened her car door and slipped inside, leaving the question hanging in the air between them. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jack's front porch as he opened the door to collect the newspaper. His boots crunched on fallen leaves, their colors a mix of amber and burgundy. There, beside the welcome mat, sat a small package wrapped in simple brown paper, tied with twine. Jack picked it up carefully, as if it might break. The familiar handwriting on the attached note made his chest tighten. For Ella, from an old friend. Grace's penmanship was neat and precise, just like he remembered from the letters she used to send Daniel. He stood in the doorway, the package heavy in his hands despite its small size. Part of him wanted to throw it in the trash, to cut off any connection before it could form. It would be easier that way, safer. But the note wasn't addressed to him. "Dad? What's that?" Ella appeared behind him, already dressed for school in her favorite blue sweater, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Someone left it for you," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He handed her the package, watching as she untied the twine with eager fingers. The smell of fresh-baked cookies filled the air as Ella opened the box. "Oh, wow," she exclaimed, lifting one to her nose. "They're still warm. Look, there's chocolate chip, oatmeal raisin, and—" She pulled out another note from inside. "It's from Mrs. Ellison, the lady from the diner yesterday." Jack's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. That's nice of her. Can we thank her? In person?" Ella's eyes lit up with that same hopeful expression that always reminded him of her mother. "Please, Dad. We could walk over after dinner." He wanted to say no. Every instinct told him to keep his distance, to protect them both from the past that Grace represented. But Ella's smile was impossible to resist. "All right," he conceded. "We'll go this evening." Throughout the day, Jack tried to focus on his work at the auto repair shop, but his mind kept drifting to the impending visit. By the time evening arrived, his hands were steady, but his nerves were not. They set out just as the sun began to set, walking side by side down maple-lined streets. Ella clutched a carefully written thank you note, talking excitedly about her day at school. Jack listened, grateful for her constant chatter that filled what would otherwise be uncomfortable silence. As they passed the old brick church, Reverend Cole was locking up for the evening. The older man's face creased into a warm smile when he saw them. "Jack, Ella, good to see you both out for a walk," the Reverend called out, pocketing his keys. "Evening, Reverend." Jack nodded, slowing their pace. "I hope you're planning to join us this Sunday," Reverend Cole said, his voice gentle but firm. "The veterans gathering after service. It would mean a lot to have you there." Jack shifted uncomfortably. "I'll think about it." "That's all I ask," the Reverend replied, his kind eyes showing understanding. "Remember, Jack, sometimes the hardest steps are the ones that lead us home." They continued their walk, turning onto Grace's street. Her house was a small white Cape Cod with blue shutters and carefully tended flower boxes. Jack's steps grew heavier as they approached the front door. Ella bounded up the porch steps and knocked before Jack could change his mind. A moment later, Grace appeared in the doorway, looking surprised but pleased. "I wanted to thank you for the cookies," Ella said, holding out her note. "They were amazing. Dad had one too, even though he usually doesn't eat sweets." Grace's eyes flickered to Jack's face before returning to Ella. "I'm so glad you liked them. Would you both like to come in? I just made coffee." "We should probably." Jack started to decline, but Ella was already stepping inside. "Just for a minute. Grace said softly. Please? The interior of Grace's home was warm and inviting, with soft lamplight and the lingering scent of coffee in the air. Family photos lined the walls, some including Daniel, Jack noticed, though he tried not to look too closely. The cookies were wonderful, Jack managed to say, his voice quieter than he intended. Thank you. It's the least I could do, Grace replied, her hands clasped together. I remember how Daniel used to talk about your sweet tooth, actually. The mention of Daniel's name hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken memories. Jack's shoulders tensed, but he forced himself to nod. We should head back, he said after a moment. Ella has homework to finish. Of course, Grace said, understanding in her eyes. Thank you for coming by. They said their goodbyes, and Jack guided Ella back outside into the growing darkness. The streetlights had come on, casting pools of yellow light on the sidewalk. From her window, Grace watched their departure, father and daughter walking side by side, Jack's tall figure slightly hunched, as if carrying an invisible burden. He paused beneath a streetlight, adjusting Ella's scarf against the evening chill, before continuing down the street toward home. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows of the Mercer home, casting warm squares of light across the worn linoleum floor. Ella stood on her tiptoes, reaching for the cereal box on the top shelf when something caught her eye. There, tucked away in the corner of the highest cabinet, was an old wooden box with faded lettering that read, Iraq 2008. Her father was outside tinkering with the truck engine. Curiosity got the better of her. Using a chair for height, she carefully pulled down the dusty box and set it on the kitchen table. The hinges creaked as she opened it, revealing a collection of memories her father had hidden away. Inside, she found several medals nestled in velvet pouches, their bronze and silver surfaces still gleaming. Beneath them lay a stack of worn letters, held together with a faded rubber band. But what drew her attention most was a photograph, its edges slightly curved from age. In the photo, 6 men stood arm in arm, desert-colored uniforms covered in dust, but their smiles bright against the backdrop of sand and sky. She recognized her father immediately, younger, less gray in his hair, and something else different about him. He was laughing, really laughing, in a way she'd never seen before. Next to him stood a handsome soldier with kind eyes and a confident stance. Ella. Her father's voice made her jump. Jack stood in the doorway, hands still greasy from working on the truck. His face had gone pale. I'm sorry, Dad, Ella said quickly, starting to close the box. I was just reaching for cereal and… No, Jack said softly, wiping his hands on a rag. It's okay. He walked over and sat down heavily in the chair beside her. For a long moment, he just stared at the photo she'd been holding. Is that… Ella hesitated, pointing to the man beside her father in the picture. Is that Mrs. Ellison's husband? Jack nodded slowly. Daniel Ellison. His voice was rough with emotion. The bravest man I ever knew. What was he like? Jack picked up the photo, his fingers trembling slightly. He was our leader, not just because of rank. People followed him because he cared. He'd give you his last drop of water in the desert, share his letters from home when guys were feeling low. He managed a small smile, had the worst singing voice you've ever heard, but he'd belt out country songs during long patrols just to keep our spirits up. Ella watched her father's face carefully. You miss him. Every day. Jack set the photo down and rubbed his face. He saved all our lives more times than I can count. Always put everyone else first. Even. He stopped, his jaw tightening. Even what, Dad? Even at the end. Jack stood up abruptly, pushing back from the table. That's enough for now, honey. We should get these put away. Across town at the Valley View Medical Clinic, Grace sat in the break room, stirring her coffee absently. The morning rush had slowed, giving her a moment to catch her breath. Her colleague Sarah dropped into the chair across from her. You look like you've seen a ghost, Sarah said, studying Grace's face. Grace set down her spoon. I did. Sort of. She took a shaky breath. Jack Mercer is alive. Sarah frowned. Jack Mercer? Daniel's friend from the unit? I thought, we all did, Grace cut in. For years I thought he died with Daniel in that ambush. But he's here, Sarah. Living right here in town with his daughter. Oh, honey. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Grace's hand. Maybe it's better to leave the past where it is. You've worked so hard to move forward. Grace pulled her hand away. Move forward? I've been stuck in the same place for 5 years, wondering what happened that day. Nobody would tell me details. The official report was so empty. She stared into her coffee cup. But Jack was there. He knows the truth. And what if the truth hurts more than not knowing? Grace looked up at her friend, eyes bright with unshed tears. How could it? Not knowing, that's what keeps me up at night. Did Daniel suffer? Was he afraid? Did he? She swallowed hard. Did he say anything at the end? Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the buzz of her pager. Emergency in room 4, she said, standing quickly. Promise me you'll be careful, Grace. Some doors are better left closed. Later that evening, as sunset painted the sky in deep purples and oranges, Grace's footsteps echoed in the empty church. She made her way to the small memorial alcove where photos of fallen service members lined the wall. Daniel's smile beamed down at her from a silver frame, the same photo she kept on her nightstand. She lit a single candle, its flame casting dancing shadows across his face. The familiar ache in her chest felt different now, charged with something new. Purpose, maybe, or hope. If he's here, she whispered to Daniel's photo, her voice barely audible in the quiet sanctuary. Maybe there's something I still need to know. The candle flickered, and Grace watched the flame steady itself, burning bright and true in the growing darkness. The evening sky had turned an angry shade of gray, unleashing sheets of rain that drummed against the windows of the Mercer home. Jack and Ella sat on their worn leather couch, the blue glow of the television washing over them as they watched a rerun of an old sitcom. Thunder rolled in the distance, and Ella instinctively moved closer to her father. Maybe we should make some popcorn, Ella suggested, just as 3 sharp knocks cut through the sound of rain and canned laughter. Jack's shoulders tensed. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not in this weather. Rising from the couch, he crossed the living room in measured steps. When he opened the door, he found Grace Ellison standing on his porch, her dark hair plastered to her face, rainwater dripping from her coat. I'm sorry, she said, wrapping her arms around herself. I know it's late, but I couldn't sleep. I haven't been able to sleep since the ceremony. Her voice trembled slightly. Whether from the cold or emotion, Jack couldn't tell. I need to know what happened to Daniel. Jack's hand tightened on the doorknob. Behind him, Ella appeared in the hallway, concern etched on her young face. You should come in, Jack said finally, stepping aside. You're soaked. Grace hesitated for a moment before crossing the threshold. Water pooled beneath her feet on the welcome mat as she stood there, looking lost and determined all at once. Let me get you a towel, Ella offered, disappearing down the hallway before anyone could respond. She returned moments later with a fluffy blue towel, holding it out to Grace with a gentle smile. Thank you, sweetheart, Grace said, managing a small smile in return as she dried her face and hair. Jack led them into the living room, turning off the television. The silence that followed felt heavy, broken only by the steady drumming of rain against the windows and occasional rumbles of thunder. Can I take your coat? Ella asked ever the thoughtful host. Grace shrugged off her wet coat, revealing a simple sweater underneath. She sat on the edge of the armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jack remained standing, his body rigid, like a soldier at attention. I know it's hard, Grace began, her voice quiet but steady. But I've spent years wondering, imagining every possible scenario. The official report was so clinical. I need to hear it from someone who was there, someone who knew him. Jack's jaw clenched. He moved to the window, staring out into the darkness. Some things are better left in the past, Grace. Not this, she insisted. Not when it's eaten away at me for so long. Please, Jack, even if it's just something, anything. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating Jack's face for a brief moment. The pain in his expression was raw, unguarded. Dad? Ella said softly from her perch on the couch. Maybe it would help to talk about it. Jack turned, looking at his daughter. Her face held that same unwavering compassion that her mother had possessed. He drew a deep breath. Daniel, he started, then paused, choosing his words carefully. Daniel was the best of us. He didn't deserve what happened. None of them did. Grace leaned forward slightly. Was he? Was he afraid? No, Jack said firmly, finally meeting her eyes. He was thinking about you until the end. He was brave, always brave. Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but she blinked them back. "The letter they gave me. His last letter. He wrote about coming home. About starting a family." Jack's hands curled into fists at his sides.
"He talked about you all the time, showed us your pictures, told us how lucky he was."
The silence that followed was deafening. Ella looked between the adults, sensing the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. "I'll make some hot cocoa," she announced suddenly, standing up. "Mom always said hot cocoa makes everything better." Grace gave a watery chuckle. "That's very kind of you, Ella." While Ella busied herself in the kitchen, the clink of mugs and spoons providing a welcome distraction, Grace and Jack sat in a silence that felt slightly less strained. "I don't blame you," Grace said softly, "for surviving. I wanted to for so long, but I don't." Jack's voice was rough when he responded. "Maybe you should." "No." Grace shook her head. "Daniel wouldn't want that. He trusted you with his life. Whatever happened out there—" "Here we go," Ella interrupted, carrying a tray with 3 steaming mugs, each topped with a generous helping of mini marshmallows. "Careful, they're hot." The 3 of them sat together, sipping their cocoa as the storm continued outside. For a moment, they were just people sharing a warm drink on a cold night, the weight of the past temporarily lifted by Ella's simple act of kindness. When Grace finally stood to leave, the rain had lessened to a steady drizzle. Jack retrieved her coat, now mostly dry thanks to the heating vent it had been hanging near. "Thank you," Grace said, slipping it on, "for telling me what you could. It helps, knowing he wasn't alone." Jack nodded, unable to find the right words. Ella gave Grace a quick hug, extracting a promise to come over again soon. From the doorway, Jack watched as Grace made her way to her car, the red taillights glowing through the misty rain. As they faded into the darkness, he closed the door and leaned his forehead against it. "I'm sorry, Danny," he whispered so quietly that even Ella, standing a few feet away, couldn't hear him. The church bells echoed across Main Street, their familiar sound drawing people toward the white wooden building with its tall spire reaching into the crisp morning sky. Jack Mercer stood at the back of the church, his shoulders tense beneath his pressed blue shirt. His daughter Ella had gone to sit with her friends in the youth section, leaving him alone with his thoughts. From his position, he could see Grace talking with Reverend Cole near the altar. Her honey blonde hair caught the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, creating a soft halo around her. She smiled at something the Reverend said, but Jack noticed how the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, contemplating a quick exit through the heavy wooden doors behind him. The morning service had ended, and most people were filtering out or gathering in small groups to chat. No one would notice if he slipped away now. "Jack," Reverend Cole's warm voice carried across the nearly empty church. "Come join us for a moment, won't you?" Jack's jaw tightened, but years of military discipline made him respond to the direct request. His footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor as he made his way down the center aisle. Grace turned to face him, her hands clasped together in front of her. "Good to see you here today," Reverend Cole said, placing a gentle hand on Jack's shoulder. "Grace and I were just discussing the upcoming Veteran Support Group meeting. Would you consider attending?" Jack's throat felt dry. "I don't know if that's—" "Daniel always believed you'd come home," Grace interrupted softly. Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. The statement hit Jack like a physical blow. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. Daniel's face flashed in his mind. Young, confident, always ready with a joke to lift spirits during the darkest moments. "He talked about you in his letters," Grace continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Said you were the strongest person he knew." Reverend Cole watched them both with knowing eyes. "Sometimes strength means allowing others to help carry our burdens, Jack." Jack managed a stiff nod, but the walls of the church suddenly felt too close. "Excuse me," he mumbled, turning away from Grace's questioning gaze. "I need to check on Ella." He found his daughter outside, but she was deep in conversation with her friends. Rather than interrupt, he sent her a quick text saying he'd wait in the truck. The cab of his pickup felt like a sanctuary, a place where he could breathe again. That night, sleep refused to come. Jack tossed and turned, Grace's words echoing in his mind. "Daniel always believed you'd come home." When exhaustion finally pulled him under, the dreams came immediately. Heat, dust, the rumble of engines. In his dream, he was back there, the narrow street in Fallujah, Buildings rose like dirty sandcastles on either side. Daniel sat across from him in the Humvee, checking his weapon with practiced ease. "Something feels off, Sarge," Daniel said, using Jack's old rank. Jack scanned the empty windows above them. "We push through. Command wants us to." The explosion came first, then the gunfire. Chaos erupted all around them, men shouting, bullets pinging off metal, the acrid smell of burning rubber and cordite. "Fall back," Jack heard himself yell. "Fall back." But Daniel was moving forward, providing cover fire for the pinned second vehicle. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the smoke-filled street. "I've got them, Sarge! Get our boys out!" "Daniel, no. That's not the plan." The rest disappeared in a deafening blast and a cloud of debris. Jack jolted awake, his shirt soaked with sweat, heart hammering against his ribs. The digital clock on his nightstand showed 4:17 a.m. "It was my call," he whispered into the darkness. "My fault." He stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. The man in the mirror looked haunted, dark circles under his eyes, several days' worth of stubble on his jaw. The first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky outside his window when he finally sat on the edge of his bed. Grace's kind eyes and gentle words from that morning contrasted sharply with the nightmare images still fresh in his mind. She deserved to know, not just the sanitized version in the official report, but the full truth about that day, about his decision that had cost her husband his life. The weight of the secret had become unbearable. Even if telling her meant losing the fragile connection they'd begun to rebuild, even if it meant facing the judgment of the entire town, she needed to know. Daniel would have wanted her to know. Jack watched the sunrise paint his bedroom walls in soft orange light. The truth would destroy whatever peace Grace had found, whatever forgiveness she might be working toward. It would confirm her worst fears about why her husband didn't come home. But keeping it hidden was its own kind of betrayal, of Daniel's memory, of Grace's trust, of his own honor. He sat there, the morning light spilling across his bed, knowing that the next time he saw Grace, everything would change. The weight of command decisions never truly lifted, he realized. They just transformed into different kinds of burdens. The burden of survival, of memory, of truth. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jack's driveway as he climbed into his old pickup truck. His hand shook slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, the metal of his dog tags cool against his palm. He'd carried them everywhere since coming home, a constant reminder of the weight he bore. Ella had already left for school, sparing him the need to explain where he was going so early. The truck's engine rumbled to life, and Jack sat there for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. The drive to Grace's house wasn't long, but every mile felt heavy with purpose. Grace's modest white house came into view, its garden neat and well-tended. Jack pulled up to the curb, his throat tight. Through the kitchen window, he could see her moving about, probably preparing her morning coffee. The normalcy of the scene made what he had to do even harder. He walked up the path, each step deliberate. Before he could knock, Grace opened the door, as if she'd been expecting him. She wore a simple blue sweater, her face showing cautious concern. "Jack?" Her voice was soft, questioning. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. "There's something you need to know." Grace hesitated, then stepped aside. The kitchen smelled of coffee and cinnamon, reminding Jack of peaceful mornings that felt a lifetime away. She gestured to a chair at her small kitchen table, but Jack remained standing, his dog tag still clutched in his fist. "What is it?" Grace asked, wrapping her arms around herself. Jack swallowed hard. "It's about Daniel. About what happened that day." Grace's posture stiffened. She leaned against the counter, as if needing its support. "We were running reconnaissance," Jack began, his words coming out mechanical, rehearsed. "There were 2 routes through the village. The main road was exposed, but faster. The back route was longer but provided more cover." He paused, his chest tight. "I was lead tactical officer that day. The call, it was mine to make." Grace's face had gone pale, her knuckles white where she gripped the counter's edge. "I chose the main road," Jack continued, each word feeling like glass in his throat. "We were behind schedule, I thought. I thought we could make it through fast enough." His voice cracked. "The insurgents were waiting. They had the high ground, and we were exposed. Daniel's squad." He stopped, fighting for control. "No, Grace whispered, shaking her head. No, don't tell me this. Daniel saw them first. He pushed me down when the shooting started. Jack's voice broke completely. He died saving me. If I'd chosen the other route, Grace's face had transformed, shock giving way to something harder, colder. Get out, she said, her voice trembling. Get out of my house. Grace, get out, she screamed, her voice raw with pain and fury. Jack backed away, his heart hammering. As he stumbled out the door, he noticed Mrs. Peterson watering her flowers next door, her eyes wide with shock at the commotion. The drive home passed in a blur. By noon, his phone started buzzing with messages from people in town. Someone had overheard. Word was spreading fast in their small community. At the grocery store, conversations stopped when he walked in. The cashier, who usually chatted with him, barely met his eyes. Outside the hardware store, he heard whispers, "Got his whole unit killed. And we thought he was a hero." The weight of their judgment pressed down on him like a physical thing. The carefully constructed life he'd built here was crumbling, just as he'd always feared it would. As evening fell, Jack found himself parking his truck near the town memorial. The granite surface gleamed in the fading light, and he traced Daniel's name with his eyes. The engraved letters seemed to accuse him. Daniel James Ellison, beloved husband, soldier, hero. I don't deserve to be here, Jack whispered to the cold stone, his breath fogging in the evening air. The dog tags in his hand felt impossibly heavy, like they carried the weight of all his guilt. Behind him, the town's lights began to wink on one by one, but Jack remained in the growing darkness, haunted by the truth he'd finally spoken aloud. The fluorescent lights of Mason's grocery hummed overhead as Jack pushed his cart down the cereal aisle. He needed just a few things: milk, bread, and Ella's favorite cereal. Simple errands that had never felt so difficult before. Mrs. Peterson, who usually chatted with him about her garden, quickly turned her cart around when she saw him coming. Near the dairy section, Tom Wilson, a fellow veteran who'd always greeted him warmly, suddenly became very interested in comparing yogurt labels. The whispers followed him like shadows. I heard he led them right into it, all those men, and he never said anything. Jack kept his eyes forward, his shoulders straight, the military posture ingrained in him becoming armor against their stares. At the checkout, the teenage cashier barely met his gaze, rushing through scanning his items. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed him his change, as if his guilt might somehow be contagious. Outside, the morning sun felt too bright, too exposing. Jack loaded his groceries methodically, each movement measured and controlled, fighting the urge to jump in his truck and drive until Mason's Creek was just a speck in his rearview mirror. At home, he found Grace's number had been disconnected when he tried to call. Her clinic supervisor said she'd taken a few personal days. The town had already decided what that meant. She must hate him now. But Jack knew better. He'd seen the confusion in her eyes more than anger. The way she'd wrapped her arms around herself as if holding together breaking pieces. The doorbell rang that afternoon. Reverend Cole stood on his porch, his kind face creased with concern. "Thought you might want some company," he said, holding up a thermos. "Coffee's still hot." They sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the window and catching dust motes in its beams. The Reverend poured 2 cups, the rich aroma filling the quiet space between them. "People are talking," Jack said finally, staring into his cup. "People always talk," Reverend Cole replied, his voice gentle but firm. "It's what they do when they don't understand something. But understanding will come, Jack. Confession isn't the end. It's the beginning of healing." Jack's hands tightened around his mug. "Maybe they're right to talk. Maybe I don't deserve—" "Don't," the Reverend cut him off. "Don't finish that thought. You came back for a reason, Jack. Running now won't honor that reason, or Daniel's memory." The sound of Daniel's name made Jack flinch. "I see them all packing up to leave," he admitted quietly. "They think I'm going to run again. Are you?" Before Jack could answer, the front door opened and closed. Ella's footsteps approached, then stopped in the kitchen doorway. Her backpack slid from her shoulder to the floor with a thud. "You can't leave," she said immediately, her voice small but determined. Her eyes were red, rimmed, and Jack realized with a pang that she'd been crying. "I heard Kelly Martinez at school. She said her mom said, 'You're probably going to disappear again. But you can't.'" Jack stood, reaching for her, but Ella wasn't finished. She stepped forward, chin raised. I know something bad happened. I know people are saying things. But we're supposed to be brave, right? That's what you always tell me. So be brave now, Dad. Stay, please. She flew into his arms then, and Jack held her tight, meeting Reverend Cole's gentle gaze over her head. The older man nodded slightly, standing to leave them alone. I'll see myself out, he said softly. Remember what I said, Jack. Healing starts here. After the Reverend left, Jack and Ella sat together on the old porch swing, the chains creaking gently as they swayed. The afternoon light was turning golden, casting long shadows across their yard. Ella had brought out the wooden box she'd found earlier that week, the one marked Iraq 2008. Can we read some more? She asked hesitantly. The letters, I mean. If it's okay. Jack nodded, unable to speak. Ella carefully lifted out one of Daniel's letters, the paper worn soft at the creases from repeated readings years ago. She unfolded it with gentle fingers, scanning until she found the part she wanted to read. The nights are long here, she began, her voice clear in the quiet evening air. But knowing I've got brothers watching my back makes them easier to bear. Jack's got us running drills until we could do them in our sleep, but he's right. It'll keep us alive out here. Jack closed his eyes, remembering Daniel's voice, his laugh, the way he could lift the whole unit's spirits with just a few words. If I don't make it home, Ella continued, her voice softening, tell Jack he was the best brother I ever had. The words hit Jack like physical blows. His shoulders began to shake, and he pressed his hands to his face as silent tears slipped between his fingers. Ella set the letter aside and wrapped her arms around him, holding on tight as the sun set and the crickets began their evening song. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Sometimes love was strongest in silence, in simply being there while someone's heart broke and began the long journey of putting itself back together again. Grace slumped in her chair at the Veterans Clinic break room, her coffee growing cold between her hands. The chipped ceramic mug bore the faded logo of a local diner that had closed years ago, another casualty of time and change. The morning light filtered through the dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor that had seen thousands of footsteps from veterans seeking solace and healing. Her mind kept replaying Jack's words from yesterday, each syllable etched with pain and raw honesty. It was my call, my fault. The fluorescent light above buzzed intermittently, adding to the heavy silence that seemed to press down on her shoulders. She stared at the motivational posters on the walls, cheerful messages about courage and healing that felt hollow in the face of her churning emotions. She closed her eyes, remembering Daniel's smile in their last photo together, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed at her terrible jokes, the sound of his voice when he called her his amazing Grace. The memory, once sharp with grief and crystal clear in its sweetness, now felt clouded with confusion and doubt. How could the man she loved have trusted someone who'd led him to his death? Lord, she whispered, her fingers wrapped tightly around her coffee mug until her knuckles turned white. Help me understand what you're asking of me. Help me find the right path through this darkness. The break room door creaked open, its hinges protesting with a sound that had become as familiar as her own breathing. Charlie Martinez, one of their regular patients, stood in the doorway with his carved wooden cane, a gift from his grandson who'd made it in woodshop. His weathered face, marked by decades of sun and sorrow, softened when he saw her distress. Mind if I join you, Miss Grace? He asked, his voice gentle but carrying the gravelly tone of a man who'd seen too much and said too little for too many years. Grace wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand and gestured to the plastic chair across from her. The furniture had seen better days, much like everything else in the clinic that survived on donations and the goodwill of volunteers. Of course not, Charlie. I could use the company. He eased himself down with a grunt that spoke of old injuries and older pain, his bad leg stretched out to the side at an angle that looked uncomfortable but was the only position that didn't send fire up his spine. The shrapnel was still there. The doctors had said too close to nerves and arteries to risk removing. Been coming here long enough to know when someone's carrying a heavy load, Charlie said, tapping his cane against the floor in a rhythm that reminded Grace of a slow heartbeat. Recognize the look because I've worn it myself plenty of times. Grace managed a weak smile that felt foreign on her face. That obvious, huh? War leaves marks on all of us, Charlie said, his voice taking on the weight of hard-earned wisdom. He tapped his cane against the floor again, then gestured toward his leg. Some you can see, like this leg of mine that don't work right anymore. Others, he touched his chest, right over his heart. Those are the ones that take longest to heal. Sometimes they never do. Grace set her coffee down on the small round table between them, studying the old veteran's face. Lines mapped his features like rivers on weathered terrain, each one telling a story of survival and endurance. Charlie, how do you forgive someone when what they did changed your whole life? When their choice took away everything you thought your future would be? Charlie was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, as if he were looking through the walls and across decades to battles fought in jungles half a world away. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful weight of someone who'd thought long and hard about such questions. You know, when I came back from Nam, I carried so much guilt it nearly broke my back. Things I did to survive, things I didn't do to save my buddies, choices that got good men killed while I walked away, breathing. He leaned forward, his voice dropping low but remaining clear as mountain water. Took me years to understand something. Sometimes guilt's the only way a good man keeps his soul alive. It means he cares about the cost of what happened. The words hit Grace like a physical force, settling in her chest with an ache that was both painful and oddly comforting. She thought of Jack's face during his confession, not just the raw anguish, but something deeper, the way his hands had shaken. The years of carrying that burden alone, raising his daughter while living with a weight that would have crushed a lesser man. Her shift ended as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reminded her of better days. Instead of turning left toward home and the quiet house that still echoed with Daniel's absence, Grace found herself driving past Jack's neighborhood. The modest two-story home sat on a tree-lined street where children's bicycles dotted front yards and porch lights began to flicker on like earthbound stars. She slowed the car, about to drive past and retreat to the safety of her own solitude, when she saw him. Jack was in the front yard, kneeling beside Ella's old purple bicycle that had seen better days. His tools were spread out on the grass around him in careful order, wrenches and screwdrivers arranged like surgical instruments. He worked on the chain with movements that were methodical and patient, the same way he'd once field-stripped his rifle or planned tactical movements. The porch light cast long shadows across his face, highlighting not just the exhaustion etched there, but something else, a tenderness that spoke of countless evenings spent maintaining the small things that made his daughter's world run smoothly. Ella sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a light pink jacket against the evening chill that carried the promise of autumn. Her legs swung back and forth as she watched her father work, occasionally offering encouragement or asking questions about what he was doing. Even from the street, Grace could see the love and worry in the girl's eyes, the way children look at parents they adore but sense are struggling with burdens too heavy to share. This wasn't the face of a murderer or a coward. This was a father trying to keep his daughter's world turning despite everything crumbling around him. A man who'd carried the weight of his decisions for years, who'd raised his daughter alone while bearing that crushing guilt, who still took time to fix her bicycle chain even when his own heart was breaking. Grace thought of Daniel then, not of his death or the circumstances that led to it, but of his life, how he'd always spoken of Jack with such respect and brotherhood in his letters home. Jack's the kind of man who'd die for any of us. He'd written in one of his final letters, the ink now faded but the words still clear in her memory. The kind of leader who loses sleep making sure his men are safe. If something happens to me, know that it wasn't because Jack didn't try everything to bring us all home. Something shifted in Grace's heart as she watched Jack test the bicycle's pedals, Ella clapping and cheering when they turned smoothly. The anger that had flared at his confession, hot and righteous and consuming, began to soften around the edges, making room for something else, understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of it. She drove home slowly through streets that held 20 years of memories, Charlie's words echoing in her mind like a prayer or a promise. Sometimes guilt's the only way a good man keeps his soul alive. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with a kind of light that made everything look new and possible. Grace stopped at Miller's flower shop before the clinic opened, the bell above the door chiming softly as she entered the familiar space filled with the scent of roses and baby's breath. Mrs. Miller raised her eyebrows when Grace asked for daisies, simple white daisies, Daniel's favorite, because he said they looked like hope made visible, but said nothing as she wrapped them in simple brown paper tied with twine. The older woman had learned long ago when to ask questions and when to simply provide what was needed. The sun was just rising as Grace parked in front of Jack's house, painting the sky in soft pastels that reminded her of watercolor paintings. The porch was empty, the house quiet except for the distant sound of morning birds beginning their daily songs. She placed the bouquet carefully by the front door, tucking a small note beneath the flowers where the morning dew couldn't reach it. Her hand trembled slightly as she stepped back, looking at the words she'd written in her careful script. Healing takes two. Some wounds are too deep to bear alone. She drove away as the first rays of sunlight touched the daisies, turning their white petals to gold and casting everything in the warm glow of possibility. The Veterans Committee meeting room buzzed with tension as afternoon sunlight streamed through the dusty windows. 10 committee members sat around the worn oak table, their coffee cups and water bottles scattered between stacks of papers. Chairman Miller, a gray-haired Vietnam veteran, cleared his throat and tapped his gavel. Next item, speakers for the candlelight vigil, he announced, his weathered face serious. Jack Mercer was nominated, but given recent developments, we need to discuss this. The room erupted in overlapping voices. Tom Bradford, who owned the hardware store, shook his head. It ain't right. Having him speak would dishonor the fallen. You weren't there, Tom, argued Mike Peterson, a Desert Storm vet. Combat decisions aren't black and white. We've all carried guilt home. Grace sat quietly in her corner chair, her hands folded in her lap. She watched the men argue, their faces red with emotion. Her heart ached, remembering Jack's broken confession. The truth had cost him everything. But wasn't that worth something? He lied to us for years, someone called out. No, Grace heard herself say. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. She took a deep breath. He didn't lie. He carried his guilt silently, punishing himself every day. Her voice grew stronger. I lost my husband that day, and yes, I'm still processing. But Jack came back broken, not evil. Across town, unaware of the debate about him, Jack Mercer stood on the Veteran Hall's roof. Sweat dripped down his face as he hammered new shingles into place. Below him, 3 other veterans passed up supplies, their easy banter floating up with the autumn breeze. Hey, Mercer, called Rico Martinez. Remember that sandstorm in Fallujah? Couldn't see 3 feet in front of us. Jack allowed himself a small smile. Yeah, you walked straight into a tent pole and cursed in Spanish for 10 minutes straight, added Dave Wilson, chuckling. Good times. The familiar rhythm of work and camaraderie eased something in Jack's chest. These men knew war. They understood its weight. They didn't ask questions or cast judgment. They just passed up more shingles and shared old stories. By late afternoon, Jack's truck pulled into his driveway. Ella sat on the porch steps, homework spread around her. She looked up as he approached, noticing the slight lift in his shoulders, the ghost of contentment on his face. Good day, Dad? She asked hopefully. Jack nodded, running a hand through his dust-covered hair. Yeah, kiddo. Got the roof mostly done. Ella beamed. You're smiling? I mean, kind of. She jumped up and hugged him, not minding his sweaty work clothes. Want some lemonade? I made it fresh. Inside, Jack showered while Ella heated up leftover casserole. The house felt lighter somehow, as if the simple act of honest work had cleared some of the shadows. They ate together, Ella chattering about school and her art project, Jack listening with genuine interest. The doorbell rang just as they finished cleaning up. Reverend Cole stood on the porch, his kind face illuminated by the setting Sunday. Evening, Jack, he said warmly. Mind if I come in? Jack led him to the living room, where Ella had already brought out cookies and fresh coffee. She squeezed her father's arm before disappearing upstairs, leaving the men alone. Heard you were up on the hall roof today, Reverend Cole began, accepting a steaming mug. Place needed it badly. Jack nodded, sinking into his armchair. Least I could do. The Veterans Committee met this afternoon, the Reverend continued carefully. About the vigil speakers. Jack's shoulders tensed. They don't want me there. I understand. Actually, Reverend Cole leaned forward. There was quite a debate, and Grace, she spoke up for you. Jack's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. What? She reminded everyone that courage comes in many forms, including the courage to face hard truths. The Reverend's eyes were gentle. She hasn't fully processed everything yet, Jack. But she sees your pain, your honesty. She defended you. Jack set down his cup, his hands trembling slightly. The weight of Grace's unexpected advocacy pressed against his chest. After everything he'd confessed, after the pain he'd caused her, I don't deserve her kindness, he whispered, staring at his weathered hands. The scene that had started with heated debate now settled into quiet reflection, as autumn darkness gathered outside and two men sat in contemplative silence, surrounded by the lingering aroma of coffee and the subtle presence of Grace. The late September air held a gentle chill as the sun painted the sky in deep oranges and purples. On the town square, hundreds of people gathered around the Veterans Memorial, each holding an unlit candle. Paper lanterns strung between the old oak trees swayed softly in the evening breeze. Jack stood at the edge of the crowd, his daughter Ella close by his side. His hands trembled slightly as he held his own candle, the white wax smooth and cool against his calloused palm. He watched as Reverend Cole stepped up to the temporary stage, testing the microphone with a gentle tap. "Friends, neighbors," the Reverend's voice carried across the hushed gathering. "We're here tonight to remember, to honor, and to heal." The crowd murmured in agreement as volunteers began moving through the rows, lighting the first candles. The flame passed from person to person, a warm glow spreading through the darkness like stars appearing in the night sky. Jack's throat tightened as the light reached him and Ella. She squeezed his arm gently as she helped him light his candle. The soft illumination revealed familiar faces in the crowd, veterans he'd worked with on the hall roof, neighbors who'd stopped speaking to him, others who had stood by him. Near the front, he spotted Grace, her face serene in the candlelight. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair caught by the evening breeze. After a hymn and a prayer, Reverend Cole introduced Grace. Jack's heart pounded as she made her way to the microphone. She looked so much like she had years ago, when Daniel first brought her to meet the unit. Her hands clasped together as she faced the crowd. "Good evening," Grace began, her voice wavering slightly before finding its strength. "Many of you knew my husband, Daniel. He was a son of this town, a soldier who gave his life serving others." She paused, drawing a deep breath. "For years after we lost him, I lived in darkness. I blamed God, fate, and the man who came home when my Daniel didn't." Jack felt Ella's grip tighten on his arm. Around him, the crowd grew perfectly still, only the whisper of wind in the trees breaking the silence. "But darkness," Grace continued, "it doesn't heal anything. It just keeps us from seeing the truth." Her eyes found Jack in the crowd. "The truth is that war takes good men and leaves others to carry burdens we can't imagine. The truth is that blame doesn't bring anyone back." She pulled a folded paper from her pocket, one of Daniel's letters, Jack realized with a start. "My husband once wrote to me about his brother in arms, Jack Mercer," he said. "Jack's the kind of man who'd die for any of us without hesitation. The kind of leader who loses sleep making sure his men are safe." Tears glinted in the candlelight as they rolled down Grace's cheeks. "I've learned something about courage these past weeks. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't charging into battle. It's facing the truth, even when it breaks your heart. It's staying when everything in you wants to run." She turned fully toward Jack now, her voice growing stronger. "Forgiveness isn't earned. It's given. And I forgive you, Jack Mercer. Not because you asked for it, but because that's what Daniel would have wanted. Because that's what love does. It lights the way home." The silence that followed felt holy somehow. Jack barely registered moving through the crowd, but suddenly he was there, standing before Grace. Tears blurred his vision as he took her trembling hand in his. "Thank you," he whispered, the words carrying years of guilt and gratitude. Grace squeezed his hand, a gentle smile breaking through her tears. Behind them, someone began singing "Amazing Grace." The melody spread through the crowd like the candlelight had earlier, voices joining one by one until the square filled with harmony. Jack stood there, holding Grace's hand as the hymn washed over them. The weight he'd carried since that dusty road in Iraq began to lift. Not completely, but enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to hope. For the first time since he'd come home, he felt peace settle into his bones. Not the false peace of running or hiding, but the true peace that comes with forgiveness freely given. The candles flickered in the growing darkness, hundreds of tiny lights pushing back the night. Beside him, Ella slipped her hand into his free one, completing a circle of healing that had been years in the making. Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound. That saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. The familiar words carried on the evening air as the last light of day faded from the sky. leaving only the warm glow of candles and the knowledge that even the deepest wounds could heal under the gentle touch of Grace. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the VA clinic, casting long shadows across the polished linoleum floors. Jack knelt beside an old treadmill, his tool belt spread out beside him as he tightened loose screws and adjusted the worn belt. The familiar smell of antiseptic and coffee filled the air, mixing with the metallic scent of machine oil. "Thanks again for coming in, Jack," Sarah, the clinic administrator, said as she passed by with a clipboard. "That equipment's been gathering dust for weeks." Jack nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Happy to help." His voice was quiet but steady. The routine work calmed him, gave his hands purpose. Veterans shuffled past for their appointments, some nodding in recognition. The clicking of keyboards and murmur of voices created a peaceful rhythm. Grace worked her shift at the nurse's station down the hall, occasionally glancing his way. Since the vigil, they'd settled into a careful friendship, like skating on thin ice. Beautiful, but fragile. The morning passed smoothly until just after lunch. Jack was checking the wiring on an exercise bike when the first explosion cracked through the air. His body tensed instantly, muscles coiling tight. Another boom followed, closer this time. Someone called out, "Just the construction crew testing demolition charges across the street." But Jack was already gone. The sounds transported him back to that dusty road in Iraq. The taste of sand filled his mouth. The exercise bike transformed into twisted metal from the convoy. His hand shook violently as he tried to maintain his grip on reality, but the memories crashed over him like waves. Another explosion. Jack's wrench slipped, catching the bike's chain mechanism. The equipment toppled with a thunderous crash that sounded like mortar fire in his ears. He stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of metal folding chairs. "Daniel!" The name tore from his throat before he could stop it. His breathing came in ragged gasps. Somewhere in the distance, he heard voices calling his name, but they seemed to come from underwater. Sharp pain shot through his hand. He looked down to see blood streaming from where he'd caught it on the fallen equipment. The sight of red triggered another flash. Blood on sand. Daniel's face. The ambush. "Jack!" Grace's voice cut through the fog. She appeared in front of him, reaching for his injured hand. "Let me help you." But he jerked away, knocking over a table of medical supplies. Gauze and bandages scattered across the floor like snow. Other veterans pressed against the walls, their own trauma reflected in wide eyes. I can't be here," Jack choked out. The walls seemed to close in. Sarah stepped forward with concern etched on her face. "Jack, maybe you should take some time." "I'm not meant to be here." The words exploded from him like shrapnel. He stumbled toward the exit, leaving a trail of blood drops on the clean floor. Grace called after him, but he couldn't face her. Couldn't bear to see the disappointment, the fear, the recognition that he was still broken. The afternoon rain pelted his face as he burst into the parking lot. He fumbled with his truck keys, hands trembling so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he peeled out of the lot, tires squealing on wet asphalt. Hours passed in a blur as he drove aimlessly through the rain-soaked streets. The windshield wipers kept time with his racing heart. Blood from his hand stained the steering wheel, but he barely noticed the pain. As darkness fell, he found himself on a familiar street, pulling up in front of a white two-story house with blue shutters. Daniel's house. Their house. The porch light was off, but Jack could still see it clearly in his mind. Grace, standing there years ago, waving goodbye as Daniel left for his final tour. The American flag that had hung by the door. The welcome mat Daniel had insisted on buying because it made Grace laugh. Now the house stood silent, a monument to everything he'd lost, everything he'd failed to protect. The rain drummed on the truck's roof as sobs racked Jack's body. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, pressing his forehead against it as years of guilt and grief poured out. His injured hand throbbed in time with his heartbeat, blood seeping through his makeshift bandage. Through the curtain of rain, the porch seemed to shimmer like a mirage. Jack could almost see them there. Daniel and Grace, young and full of hope, before the war changed everything. Before his decision sent Daniel into that ambush. Before he came home alone, carrying the weight of survival like a stone in his chest. The downpour intensified, sheets of water obscuring the world beyond his windshield, but Jack remained motionless, lost in the storm both outside and within, as darkness settled over the empty house where happiness once lived. The morning dew still clung to the grass when Reverend Cole's weathered pickup truck pulled into Jack's driveway. The early autumn sun cast long shadows across the lawn, where fallen leaves had begun to gather in copper-colored patches. Jack was on his front porch, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, lost in thought after another sleepless night. The familiar crunch of boots on gravel made him look up. Reverend Cole approached slowly, his kind face etched with an unusual gravity. In his hand, he held a cream-colored envelope that had clearly seen better days. "Morning, Jack," the Reverend said, climbing the porch steps. His voice was gentle but carried a weight that made Jack sit up straighter. "Mind if I join you?" Jack gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Of course not, Reverend." He noticed how carefully the older man handled the envelope, as if it might crumble at any moment. "Everything all right?" Reverend Cole settled into the chair, the wood creaking beneath him. For a moment he just sat there, turning the envelope over in his hands. The morning birds called to each other in the distance, and somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. "Grace was cleaning out some old boxes yesterday," the Reverend finally said. "She found this in Daniel's things." He held up the envelope. "It's addressed to her, but I think you need to read it first." Jack's coffee cup trembled slightly in his grip. "I don't understand. Why would I?" "Because," Reverend Cole interrupted gently, "some burdens we carry aren't ours to bear. And sometimes, the truth we think we know isn't the whole story." The envelope looked soft and worn, as if it had been handled many times before being sealed. Jack could make out Grace's name written in Daniel's familiar scrawl across the front. His throat tightened. "I shouldn't," Jack protested, setting his coffee down. "That's for Grace. It's private. Daniel wrote this the night before the ambush," Reverend Cole explained, his voice steady but filled with compassion. "Grace found it tucked inside his Bible. She wants you to read it first." Jack's hands shook as he accepted the envelope. The paper felt fragile between his fingers, like it might dissolve at his touch. He stared at it for a long moment, his heart pounding against his ribs. "Take your time," the Reverend said softly. "I'll wait." With careful movements, Jack broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The letter was written in Daniel's hurried handwriting, the ink slightly faded but still clear. "My dearest Grace, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it home. There's something I need to tell you, something I've been carrying that you need to know. Tomorrow, we're heading into what intel says is hostile territory. The brass wanted us to wait for reinforcements, but I made the call to move forward." Jack argued against it. He said we should hold position, that something felt wrong. But I pulled rank. I was so sure I knew better. Jack's always been the cautious one, the one who thinks 3 steps ahead. That's why he's the best soldier I've ever known. But this time, I didn't listen. If anything happens tomorrow, it's on me, not him. I'm writing this because I know Jack. If things go wrong, he'll blame himself. He'll carry it like he carries everything. Silently, deeply, until it crushes him. Don't let him. Make sure he knows that he saved more lives than he'll ever know. All those times his instincts kept us alive. All those soldiers he brought home to their families. That's who he really is. Tell him that being my friend was one of the greatest honors of my life. Tell him that whatever happens tomorrow isn't his fault. It's my decision, my responsibility. I love you more than life itself, Grace. I'm sorry if I don't make it back to you, but if I don't, please help Jack find his way home. He deserves peace. All my love, Daniel. The paper crinkled in Jack's tightening grip. He read the words again and again, each time feeling like the ground was shifting beneath him. The weight of years of guilt pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. I don't. He struggled to form words, his vision blurring. All this time, Reverend Cole placed a steady hand on Jack's shoulder. The truth has a way of finding us when we're ready to hear it. Jack stood suddenly, the letter trembling in his hands. The morning sun seemed too bright, too harsh. Everything he'd believed about that day, every moment of self-hatred and guilt, every sleepless night, it had all been built on a misunderstanding. Daniel hadn't died because of his decision. Daniel had made the call himself. He knew, Jack whispered, his voice rough with emotion. He knew I'd blame myself. He tried to protect me even then. The weight of revelation pressed down on him, and Jack gripped the porch railing for support. Years of carrying guilt that was never his to bear crashed over him like a wave. In his mind, he saw Daniel's face, heard his voice, remembered his friendship. But now the memories were tinged with a different kind of pain. The morning breeze stirred the leaves in the yard, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll. Jack stood there, clutching his friend's last letter, as the truth slowly sank in, changing everything he thought he knew about the past. The afternoon sun cast warm rectangles of light across Grace's front porch as Jack stood there, his heart pounding against his ribs. The envelope felt heavy in his trembling hands, though it contained just a single sheet of paper. He drew in a deep breath and pressed the doorbell. Inside, he heard footsteps approaching. Grace opened the door, surprise flickering across her face. She wore a simple blue cardigan, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. "Jack?" The caution in her voice was evident, but not unkind. "I need to show you something," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "It's important." Grace studied his face for a moment, then stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in." The living room was exactly as Jack remembered it from his previous visit. Family photos on the walls, a well-worn armchair in the corner, and Daniel's military portrait prominently displayed on the mantel. The familiar scent of cinnamon and coffee hung in the air. "Would you like some coffee?" Grace asked, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her cardigan. Jack shook his head. "No, thank you." He held out the envelope. "Reverend Cole brought this to me this morning. It's from Daniel." Grace's eyes widened, and she slowly took the envelope. Her fingers traced over the familiar handwriting that spelled out her name.
"Daniel's writing," she whispered.
"I've read it," Jack admitted. "The Reverend thought I should, but it was meant for you." Grace sank into her armchair, the envelope clutched to her chest. For a long moment she just sat there, breathing deeply. Then, with careful movements, she opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. Jack watched as her eyes began to move across the page. He could almost track where she was in the letter by the changes in her expression. Surprise, confusion, understanding, and finally, tears beginning to fall. "My dearest Grace," she read aloud, her voice trembling. "If you're reading this, then I didn't make it home. There's something I need to confess." She continued reading silently, her hand covering her mouth as the tears flowed freely now. Jack stood motionless, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "It was my call," Grace read again, her voice breaking. "I made the decision to take that route. Jack advised against it, but I overruled him. If anything happens, please don't let him carry that burden. He's the best man I've ever known, and he saved more lives than he'll ever know." The paper shook in her hands. She looked up at Jack, her eyes full of understanding and pain. "All this time," she whispered, "you carried his burden." Jack's shoulders slumped, years of guilt beginning to crack and fall away. I always thought if I'd pushed harder, argued more strongly against that route." Grace stood up, the letter still in her hand. "But Daniel made his choice. He was always so stubborn about his decisions." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "You know how he was." "Yeah," Jack said hoarsely. "I do." Grace moved closer to him, her eyes searching his face. "You've been punishing yourself for years for something that wasn't your fault. Daniel wouldn't have wanted that." "I couldn't save him," Jack whispered, the words he'd held back for so long finally breaking free. "I tried, Grace. God knows I tried." "I know you did," she said softly. "Daniel knew you would. That's why he wrote this. He knew you'd blame yourself." The weight of years of self-recrimination pressed down on Jack, and his legs felt weak. Grace guided him to sit on the couch, then sat beside him. The letter lay between them, Daniel's last words finally bringing truth to light. "He wrote about how much he trusted you," Grace said, her finger tracing the lines. "How you were like a brother to him. He wanted us both to be free of this pain." Jack's vision blurred with tears. "I miss him every day." "So do I," Grace whispered. Without thinking, they turned to each other. Grace moved first, wrapping her arms around Jack's shoulders. He hesitated for just a moment before returning the embrace, both of them finally releasing years of grief and guilt. They held each other, not in romance, but in shared healing, their tears mingling as Daniel's forgiveness embraced them both from beyond. When they finally pulled apart, Grace wiped her eyes and picked up the letter again. "Thank you for bringing this to me," she said, "for letting me know the truth." Jack nodded, unable to speak. The afternoon light had shifted, casting different shadows across the room. In the quiet, they could both feel something had fundamentally changed. A burden lifted, a truth revealed, and perhaps the first real step toward healing. They sat together in comfortable silence, the letter between them, both feeling Daniel's presence in the room, not as a ghost of guilt and grief, but as a blessing of forgiveness and release. 2 days passed like a gentle breeze, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. The Veterans Hall buzzed with activity as morning light streamed through freshly cleaned windows. The scent of wet paint filled the air as Jack and several other veterans worked steadily, rolling soft, beige paint over the old walls. Ella stood on a stepladder near the entrance, carefully hanging an American flag. Her tongue poked out slightly as she concentrated on getting it perfectly straight. "Dad, does this look even to you?" she called out. Jack stepped back from his painting, brush in hand, and squinted at her work. "Maybe a little higher on the left, sweetheart." Through the main doors, Grace appeared carrying boxes of paper plates and plastic utensils. Her eyes met Jack's briefly, and they shared a small smile, the kind that carried understanding rather than awkwardness now. The letter had changed everything between them, dissolving years of misplaced guilt and blame into something softer, kinder. "The food should be here in about an hour," Grace announced, setting down her boxes. "I've got the serving tables all set up in the side room." Tom Martinez, another veteran who'd served in a different unit, clapped Jack on the shoulder as he walked past. "Looking good in here, Mercer." "Real good." The gesture was simple but meaningful. A few days ago, some of these same men had kept their distance. Reverend Cole entered his presence, bringing a familiar warmth to the room. He surveyed the work with obvious approval, noting how the old hall was transforming into something fresh and welcoming. "The Lord works in wonderful ways," he said, helping Ella down from her ladder. "Sometimes it takes a building to rebuild people." Jack dipped his roller in the paint tray, focusing on the steady motion of covering the wall. But Reverend Cole wasn't finished. He approached quietly, waiting until Jack paused in his work. "Jack," the Reverend said softly, "I've been thinking. Would you consider sharing your story at the reopening tonight?" The paint roller froze mid-stroke. Jack's shoulders tensed slightly, but he didn't immediately refuse as he might have done weeks ago. "I'm not much for public speaking, Reverend. Sometimes the most powerful words come from those who speak least often," Reverend Cole replied. "These people, this community, they need to hear the truth from you. The real truth about brotherhood and sacrifice, about carrying burdens that weren't yours to bear." Ella had wandered over, still holding a bundle of small flags. "You should do it, Dad. You've got important things to say." Grace, who had been arranging flowers on a nearby table, added gently, "Daniel would want you to speak. He always said you were the one who could really tell it like it was." Jack set down his paint roller and wiped his hands on his old jeans. The mention of Daniel's name no longer brought that sharp stab of guilt. Instead, there was a bittersweet ache, like touching an old scar that had finally healed. Throughout the afternoon, the hall continued its transformation. Veterans who had once whispered about Jack now worked alongside him, sharing stories and quiet laughs. Mrs. Peterson from the bakery brought in fresh cookies for the workers. The mayor stopped by to approve of the renovations, shaking hands with everyone, including Jack. As evening approached, the paint dried and the floors were swept. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, and the serving tables were laden with covered dishes brought by townspeople. The flags hung proud and straight, and even the old metal display case had been polished until it gleamed. Jack stood in the empty hall after most people had left to get ready for the evening ceremony. His reflection looked back at him from the display case glass. A man different from the one who had hidden from this town's judgment just days ago. At home, he paced in his living room, a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. He tried writing something formal, but the words felt stiff and wrong. "Dad, you're going to wear a hole in the carpet," Ella said from her perch on the couch. She watched him with patient amusement, her face soft with understanding beyond her years. "I don't know what to say to them, Elle," Jack admitted, running a hand through his hair. "How do I explain everything that happened? Everything we learned?" "Just tell them the truth," Ella said simply. "The real kind. Like when you finally told me about Uncle Daniel." She stood and took the crumpled paper from his hands. "You don't need this. Just talk from here." She pointed to his heart. Jack pulled his daughter into a tight hug, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. "When did you get so wise?" "Must be all those good genes," she teased, then grew serious. "Dad, I'm really proud of you. For staying. For trying. For everything." He closed his eyes, holding her close. The house felt different now. Lighter somehow, as if the weight of the past had finally begun to lift. Through the window, he could see the evening sun painting the sky in shades of hope, and for the first time in years, he felt ready to speak his truth. The Veterans Hall glowed warmly against the darkening sky, its fresh paint and polished windows reflecting the sunset's final rays. Inside, folding chairs creaked under the weight of what seemed like half the town. The air hummed with quiet conversation and anticipation. American flags hung proudly from the rafters, and a simple podium stood at the front, illuminated by soft lighting. Grace sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The pearl necklace Daniel had given her years ago caught the light as she took steady breaths to calm her nerves. Next to her, Reverend Cole's reassuring presence provided an anchor of calm. His weathered Bible rested on his knee, a ribbon marking the passage about forgiveness he'd shared earlier that day. Ella fidgeted in the seat on Grace's other side, straightening her dress for the 10th time. She kept glancing toward the side room where Jack was waiting. "He's going to do great," she whispered, though her voice carried a hint of worry. The crowd settled as Mayor Thompson stepped up to the podium. His brief introduction faded into background noise as Grace watched Jack emerge from the side room. He wore his dress blues, medals gleaming on his chest, but his face carried something new. Not just the weight of memories, but also the light of hope. Jack approached the podium with measured steps. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped its edges, but when he raised his eyes to the crowd, they were clear and determined. The microphone picked up his deep breath before he began. "For years," he started, his voice low but steady, "I've walked these streets carrying a weight that wasn't mine to bear." He paused, looking down at his notes, but then setting them aside. "Many of you know me as the survivor, the one who came back. Some of you recently learned about my guilt over the ambush that took our brothers." His eyes found Grace's, drawing strength from her encouraging nod. "But what I've learned, what this town has taught me, is that survival isn't just about making it home. It's about learning to live again." Jack's voice grew stronger with each word. "I spent years believing I was responsible for losing good men, including Daniel Ellison, one of the finest soldiers I ever knew." Grace felt tears welling up as Jack continued, his words painting pictures of brotherhood, sacrifice, and the long journey home. Around her, veterans nodded in understanding, some wiping their eyes quietly. "The truth," Jack said, his voice catching slightly, "is that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought overseas, they're fought in our hearts." He straightened his shoulders, looking directly at the crowd now. "We carry our fallen brothers with us, not as burdens of guilt, but as badges of honor. They taught us about courage, about sacrifice, and most importantly, about love." The hall fell completely silent, every person hanging on his words. Even the usual creaking of the old building seemed to pause in reverence. "What I've learned here, in this town, with all of you," Jack continued, his eyes moving from face to face, "is that healing isn't a solitary journey. It takes a community. It takes forgiveness, not just from others, but from ourselves." Grace couldn't stop the tears now. They rolled down her cheeks as she remembered Daniel's letter, the truth it revealed, and the freedom it brought to both her and Jack. "Today, as we reopen this hall," Jack said, gesturing to the freshly painted walls, "we're not just dedicating a building. We're recommitting ourselves to each other, to being there for our veterans, their families, and anyone who carries invisible wounds." His voice grew softer, but the microphone carried every word. "Daniel Ellison once told me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, despite our fears." He lived by those words, and now, finally, I understand them. The first person to stand was an elderly veteran in the back, followed quickly by others. Soon, the entire hall was on its feet, applause thundering against the walls. Grace stood too, clapping through her tears, her heart swelling with pride and something more, something that felt like healing. Reverend Cole squeezed her shoulder gently as they watched Jack step down from the podium, accepting handshakes and hugs from fellow veterans. Ella rushed to embrace her father, her face beaming with pride. The formal ceremony concluded with a prayer and the traditional playing of taps, but people lingered, sharing stories and comfort. Jack found himself surrounded by well-wishers, each wanting to share their own journey or simply thank him for his honesty. As the crowd finally began to thin, Grace made her way toward the exit, pausing to help stack a few chairs. She heard Jack's footsteps behind her and turned to find him looking at her with gentle eyes. "Would you like to step outside for some air?" he asked softly. The evening air felt cool and clean after the warmth of the hall. Stars had begun to appear in the darkening sky, twinkling like distant beacons of hope. They walked in comfortable silence, their footsteps falling in sync on the newly laid pathway. Without hesitation or words, Grace slipped her hand into his. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as if they'd been doing this for years. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The stars above, the gentle breeze, and their joined hands said everything necessary about new beginnings and healing hearts. The autumn breeze rustled through the newly planted maple trees outside the Veterans Support Center, their leaves painting the sidewalk in shades of gold and crimson. The renovated storefront, with its freshly painted blue trim and welcoming entrance, had become a beacon of hope in the small town over the past few months. Inside, afternoon sunlight streamed through large windows, warming the comfortable waiting area where Ella sat cross-legged on a plush armchair. Her homework lay forgotten as she concentrated on writing encouragement cards for the veterans in the VA hospital. Her neat handwriting filled each card with warmth and sincerity. "Dear Mr. Thompson," she read aloud softly, "I hope these flowers make you smile today. Thank you for being brave for our country. Your friend, Ella." At the front desk, Grace organized appointment schedules while sneaking glances at Jack, who sat with a young veteran in the corner. The young man's shoulders were tense, his hands wrapped tightly around a coffee cup as he spoke in hushed tones. Jack listened intently, his face showing understanding that could only come from walking the same difficult path. "I keep seeing their faces," the young vet whispered, his voice breaking. "Every night they're there." Jack leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "I know those faces, Kevin. I carried them for years. But you don't have to carry them alone." Grace watched as the tension slowly eased from Kevin's shoulders. She'd seen this transformation countless times now, the moment when a veteran realized they weren't alone in their struggles. Jack had a gift for reaching them, his own story of guilt and redemption offering hope to others still lost in their darkness. The center had become more than just a building. Veterans dropped by throughout the day, some for scheduled counseling, others just to share coffee and conversation. Old-timers mixed with young soldiers fresh from deployment, sharing stories and wisdom. The walls displayed artwork created by local veterans, including a striking painting of a sunrise over the desert that one of their regulars had donated. During a quiet moment, Grace walked over to refill Jack's coffee cup. Cream, no sugar, just the way he liked it. Their fingers brushed as she handed him the mug, and they shared a warm smile. These small moments had been building between them, gentle and unhurried, like a flower slowly opening to the Sunday. Later that afternoon, Ella helped sort through donation boxes of winter clothing for veteran families in need. She worked efficiently, having developed her own organization system over the past months. "Dad," she called out, holding up a warm jacket. "This would be perfect for Mr. Rivera's son." Jack nodded, pride evident in his eyes. His daughter had blossomed in her role here, her natural compassion touching everyone she met. The center had become a second home for her, a place where she could see her father's strength shine instead of his struggles. As evening approached, the last visitors said their goodbyes. Grace began her nightly routine of straightening chairs and checking supplies, while Jack updated case files on his laptop. The familiar rhythm of their shared work filled the space with comfortable silence. "The town council approved our expansion proposal," Grace mentioned, sorting through mail on her desk. "We can start renovating the space next door next month." Jack smiled, remembering how skeptical some council members had been initially. But the center's impact on the community had proven impossible to ignore. Veterans who'd once isolated themselves were now active community members. Families who'd struggled alone found support and understanding. They had created something meaningful together, he and Grace. Something that honored Daniel's memory while helping others heal. Their relationship had grown naturally from their shared mission, built on understanding, respect, and gradually, love. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows as they prepared to close for the day. Ella gathered her backpack, carefully placing her finished cards in an envelope for tomorrow's hospital visit. Grace checked the coffee maker one last time while Jack turned down the thermostat. Their evening routine had become comfortable and familiar. Sometimes they'd share dinner at the diner down the street. Other times Grace would cook at her place, filling her once quiet home with laughter and warmth. Tonight, they had plans for a simple meal at Jack's house. Ella had insisted on making her grandmother's lasagna recipe. Before leaving, Jack paused by the wall where Daniel's photograph hung among other fallen soldiers. The picture showed Daniel in his dress uniform, his smile bright and confident. Below it sat a small brass plaque that read, "In memory of those who served, their sacrifice guides our mission." Jack stood quietly for a moment, taking in his friend's familiar features. The weight of grief had changed over these months, transformed by forgiveness and purpose into something that strengthened rather than crushed. The center, the work they did here, the lives they touched, it all felt like fulfilling a promise to his fallen brother. "We made it home, buddy," Jack whispered softly to the photograph, his voice carrying years of shared history and hard-won peace. The words settled in the quiet space as Grace finished locking up the filing cabinets. Through the windows, the town streetlights began blinking on, one by one, like stars appearing in the evening sky. Another day of healing, of helping, of honoring those who served, and tomorrow would bring more opportunities to continue their mission. The morning sun painted the town square in warm golden light, casting long shadows across the memorial where everything had begun 1 year ago. American flags fluttered in the gentle breeze, their stars and stripes dancing against the cloudless blue sky. The familiar sound of a marching band echoed through the streets as the Veterans Day parade prepared to begin. Jack Mercer stood at the podium, adjusting his tie nervously. His hands were steady now. No more trembling, no more cold sweats. The weight that had crushed his chest for so many years had finally lifted. He watched as people filled the square, taking their seats in neat rows of white folding chairs. Grace squeezed his hand gently. "You've got this," she whispered, her eyes twinkling with pride. She wore a blue dress that matched the autumn sky, her silver necklace catching the sunlight. The same necklace that had belonged to Daniel's mother, a connection to the past that now brought comfort instead of pain. Jack's heart swelled as he spotted Ella in her junior ROTC uniform, preparing to lead the color guard. At 14, she stood tall and confident, her face beaming with pride as she gripped the American flag. Other students flanked her, but she was the one who commanded attention, just like her father. The crowd settled as Reverend Cole stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our keynote speaker, a man who has shown us the true meaning of courage, not just in battle, but in facing life's hardest truths, Mr. Jack Mercer." The applause rolled through the square like thunder. Jack noticed familiar faces in the crowd. Veterans he'd counseled at the support center, widows who'd found strength in Grace's programs, neighbors who'd moved from whispers of judgment to shouts of support. Taking a deep breath, Jack stepped to the microphone. The paper with his prepared speech stayed folded in his pocket. He wouldn't need it today. "A year ago, I stood in this very spot, hiding from the truth," he began, his voice clear and strong. "I thought being a hero meant carrying the weight alone. I was wrong." His eyes found Ella in the crowd, who gave him an encouraging nod. True courage isn't about what happens in battle. It's about what happens after, when the guns fall silent and we're left with our memories, our guilt, and our grief. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the gathering. But most importantly, it's about what happens when we finally let others help us carry that weight. The parade began to move through the square, led by Ella and the color guard. Their steps were perfectly synchronized, the flags catching the breeze in a choreographed dance of red, white, and blue. Jack watched his daughter with pride, remembering the little girl who had never given up on him, even in his darkest moment. "This town taught me something powerful," Jack continued. "It taught me that healing isn't a solitary journey. It happens in small moments, in a plate of cookies left on a porch, in a candle lit at a vigil, in the forgiveness offered by those we've hurt." Grace wiped a tear from her cheek, her smile radiant. She wore Daniel's dog tags today, not as a symbol of loss anymore, but as a bridge between past and present, between grief and healing. Some of you know my story, Jack said, his voice softening. You know about the guilt I carried, the truth I feared, and the peace I finally found. But what you might not know is that every single one of you played a part in that healing. The parade continued past the podium. Veterans groups, school bands, community organizations. Each group represented a thread in the fabric of their town, a community that had learned to heal together. Today, we honor all veterans, those who made it home and those who didn't. But we also honor the families who wait, who worry, who welcome us back even when we're not the same person who left. Jack's voice caught slightly. And we honor those who teach us that coming home isn't just about crossing an ocean or stepping off a plane. Sometimes, coming home means finding your way back to yourself. He turned to Grace, their eyes meeting in a moment of perfect understanding. Sometimes, he continued, it means letting someone else light the way back. The crowd stood as Ella's color guard completed their route, the flags dipping in perfect unison before the memorial. Jack stepped back from the podium as the applause swelled, reaching for Grace's hand. She interlaced her fingers with his, squeezing gently. You did beautifully, she whispered. Looking out over the crowd, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Complete peace. The memorial no longer loomed as a monument to his guilt. Instead, it stood as a reminder of love, sacrifice, and the power of forgiveness. As the last notes of the marching band faded and the crowd began to disperse, Jack pulled Grace close. You came back, he said softly, echoing her words from long ago. Not just from war, but from everything that tried to take you away. Grace's eyes shimmered with tears and love. We both did. Ella joined them, still carrying her flag with pride. The three of them stood together as the square slowly emptied, the late afternoon sun painting everything in warm, amber light. Without words, they began walking down Main Street, past the diner where they'd shared that first awkward meal, past the church where healing had begun, past the Veterans Hall they'd helped rebuild. Their footsteps echoed on the familiar sidewalk, three shadows merging into one in the fading sunlight. They were more than individual survivors now. They were a family, forged in the fire of truth and tempered by forgiveness. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink. Main Street stretched before them, leading not to an ending, but to a beginning. Together, they walked toward it, each step carrying them further into the future they'd built from the ashes of the past. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed this story of Jack Mercer, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.